The reading is taken from Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 to 9 and 18 to 23. The parable of the sower. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly, because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop, yielding 100, 60 or 30 times what was sown.
You know, if you're a regular follower of these services, you might notice a bit of an agricultural theme emerging at the moment. Last week, we harnessed up our oxen with an easy yoke and we ploughed the fields. And this week, we follow a sower as the seed is planted in that newly ploughed ground. And next week, we will be focusing on weed control and prevention. So I guess that this is the nearest thing that NWBA can offer to Countryfile at the moment. But I think there is a serious side to that too, because of course yokes of oxen and sowers spreading their seed and growing crops with all the challenges that this entails were very much part and parcel of the everyday life of people around Jesus at the time of his life and ministry. And in fact, today's reading marks something of a watershed in Matthew's Gospel, because this is the first account that Matthew presents us with of one of Jesus's parables, and somewhat typical of the way in which Matthew writes his Gospel. After 12 chapters without any parables at all, we have 7 that come all in the same one. So as far as Matthew is concerned, parables are a bit like buses. You don't get one for ages, and then they all come together. But it also marks a bit of a change of location, which happens a number of times through this gospel. In Matthew chapter 4, when we're introduced to the kind of opening part of Jesus' ministry, he very much places him in the synagogues. That's where his teaching, that's where his ministry is worked out. But then Jesus goes up onto a mountainside, moving out of the confines of the synagogue, and begins to teach what is famously called the Sermon on the Mount. And then in chapter 8, Jesus widens the net even more. And this time it's ethnic boundaries that he begins to cross. And so we see a Roman centurion and a Gentile outcast brought into the story of God's kingdom. And then various other outcasts are featured. And then after that, Jesus brings together his disciples and he commissions them, and he sends them out in twos to the villages and towns to declare that the kingdom of God is within your grasp. And where was it that people were to discover that the kingdom of God was within their grasp? Well, it was in their houses and at their meal tables and on their doorsteps, in the heart of their giving and receiving of hospitality as a community. And so gradually, the message of God's kingdom has moved from the confines of a defined religious community that's housed in a religious building, right across the whole of society. It's almost as if Jesus has been a bit like a farmer, casting his seed in all kinds of places and situations and soils, employing and commissioning others to similarly cast this seed. And as Jesus reminded his followers when he sent them out in twos to declare the kingdom of God, sometimes that seed would take root and bear fruit, and sometimes it would feel as if it had been scattered with no real results at all. So this set of parables serves as a kind of commentary on everything that the followers of Jesus had experienced and been involved in up to now. They're there to help them understand how their endeavours fitted into God's greater purposes. But of course, we're not the original disciples of Jesus. So the question for us is, what can we learn from this story that Jesus tells? Well, perhaps the first thing that we can notice is simply the reality of this story and the reality of the circumstances that it sought to explain. Because that journey from synagogue to mountainside to town squares and lodging houses and now into working farms and the everyday lives of people perhaps represents something of the journey that we've been on in recent weeks. We too have had to leave our religious buildings and routines behind. And I guess the question we've all found ourselves asking is, where is God in all of that? Have we left God behind in our church halls and our meeting houses? Are we desperate to get back there in the hope that God is still there waiting for us? Or do we perhaps believe, or have we perhaps even experienced that we can meet God in the many and varied places that we now find ourselves in? The stories that Jesus tells take us to the very heart of what the kingdom of God is all about. And it seems to me that what Jesus says through these stories is that it is not so much about religious routines and rituals, but about people and how they live their lives, about the places in which people live their lives, about the values and the purposes and the experiences that everyday life entails. So as we look at this story, what is it that God can say to us in the midst of our everyday lives? Now, of course, one thing that we can do is spend a lot of time looking at it and talking about all these different types of soil and whether we represent any of them or whether we feel that the field in which we are labouring seems to be like one of them. And that is kind of important because, after all, Jesus did go to the trouble of explaining what each of these types of soil represented when he was talking to his disciples later. But I want to start looking at this story from a different place first. So just take a moment to look at that simple, pretty innocuous phrase with which it begins. A farmer went out to sow seed. Now, like I said, in the heart of the rural communities of northern Israel, where Jesus first told these stories, this would have been a very familiar and an everyday sight. But I want you to imagine for a moment that you knew nothing about crop cycles and the sowing of seed and harvests and all that. So where did this seed come from that the farmer went out to sow? Well, of course, in our modern world, farmers tend to buy seed from specialist merchants who produce these carefully developed strains in their specialist laboratories and facilities. But life wasn't like that at the time of Jesus. This farmer would probably have got his seed from last year's crop. This would be the seed that a few months ago he had gone to all the back-breaking trouble of harvesting and threshing and collecting and then carefully putting away. So like I said, imagine that you knew nothing about this agricultural cycle, but you had been there a few months earlier and you'd watched this farmer going to all the trouble of harvesting a crop that he'd previously gone to all the trouble of irrigating and watering and cultivating. And then he takes this wonderful basket of seed and he throws it back into the same ground that it's just come from. Why on earth would you do that? Why, when you've put so much effort into producing and collecting it, would you scatter it back on the ground? And why on earth would you do that when the first thing that you see happening as a consequence is a whole load of wild birds flocking down onto your footpath and gobbling it all up? That just seems like a crazy and futile thing to do. And it is a crazy and futile thing to do if you don't understand the cycles of nature. But of course we do understand the cycles of nature. We do watch Countryfile. And we understand that it isn't a futile and a pointless task. It's a necessary part of a process of fruitful provision. And that's the point of parables. To take something that we do understand and use it to help explain something that we might not understand. And time again, the New Testament uses this metaphor of growing seed to explain to us something of the dynamics of God's kingdom. That farmer would actually have been crazy to keep hold of his seed. He had to throw it away. He had to cast it onto the ground and place his trust once again into the cycles of nature. He had to let go and let his seed find its way to fruitfulness. And sometimes the wisdom of the ways of God's kingdom is knowing what we need to let go of. Not clinging on to things that will never serve their purpose if they're not released. And it's interesting to notice how Jesus seems to find more resonances with the message of God's kingdom in the farms and the marketplaces than he did in the synagogues, where people huddled together to pore over their traditions and regulations that Jesus seemed to be forever in conflict with. And I think there's a really important message for us in that. You know, religious activity might be on hold at the moment, but the kingdom of God isn't. And okay, we might not find ourselves in the middle of a field with a bag full of seeds. Our situation might more nearly resemble those houses that the commissioned disciples were told to go and look for hospitality, or the moorlands and the mountainsides where the crowds gathered to hear what Jesus had to say. Or our situation might be like that man from the Gerasene that we read about in Matthew chapter 8, who lived a life of turmoil and anguish before he met Jesus. Or we might be a key worker like that Roman centurion, perhaps even as unappreciated and unwelcome as he would have been as a Roman soldier. But the seed was landing. It was taking root. These were the places where God's kingdom could be found. And it's not that it couldn't be found in the synagogues and religious meeting rooms, but they weren't the only places that it could be found. And it seems to me that the question that is asked of us by this farmer with his bag of seed is, what do we need to be prepared to let go of? What or who do we need to trust in? What do we need to be investing in if we are to see God's kingdom coming to fruition? The one thing that was for sure was that if he was going to have a harvest, if that seed was going to realize that potential that Jesus speaks of by multiplying 30 or 60 or even 100-fold, it was no use locked up in his bag. He needed to be out and scattering. And the second thing that I think we can notice from this story is that the farmer is confronted by his failures before he sees his successes. I've already hinted at that. The first result of his patient endeavours is that flocks of wild birds get a pretty decent feast at his expense. Now, some of his other failures take a little bit longer to come to light, but come to light they do. First, there's the seed that falls on rocky ground. Now, actually, this looks rather promising at first. Quick fix results often can be. But there's a reason that it's sprouting upwards with such vigour, because it can't get its roots to go downwards. So all that energy that should be going in to create a solid and sustainable root system goes into upward growth instead. And then, because it has no root, it becomes deprived of moisture and withers away. But at least other seed is growing, except that around it other things are growing too. And those other things grow to the point where they simply crowd out and choke the useful seed. So what we're confronted with as Jesus begins to tell this story is a catalogue of failure. There are some valid reasons why spreading this seed might not be such a good idea. What's the point? if it's eaten before it even hits the ground? What's the point if it withers after it's sprouted? What's the point if it's crowded out by other stuff? And of course, Jesus equates each of these to real life experiences. There are those, says Jesus, who, like the birds of the air, just don't even give the message a chance. There are those, says Jesus, who are totally up for it so long as it doesn't make any demands on them, so long as the road is easy, so long as everything works out in their interests. And there are those who do receive the message of my kingdom, but they have other concerns, other fish to fry, and sooner or later those things become more important to them, and the ways of God's kingdom just get squeezed out. Now, this is the point where we have two ways of placing ourselves into this story. We can look at it from the perspective of the sower, and everything that I've said about that can be related to our own experience of seeking to be proclaimers of God's good news. But people don't listen. People disappoint us. People have other priorities. And it seems to me that the point of this story is not to try and pretend that this is anything other than the case. In fact, Jesus makes it abundantly clear that it will be the case. But the point of the story is to remind us that these are not reasons to give up on seeking and proclaiming God's kingdom. And let's remember what I said earlier. Another inevitable reality from this story is that we are confronted by our failures before we see our successes. And this story serves to remind us that fruitfulness will nonetheless come. But we might also insert ourselves from the perspective of the soil, because as Jesus underlines in his explanation, these different types of soil are intended to represent different types of people. And I'm not so sure that we can simply use these soil types to neatly divide the world up into 4 tidy people groups. I think actually we can all have a bit of each of them in all of us. Are there times when perhaps we just don't want to hear what God has to say? Are we so set on our own course, so locked in our own routines that there isn't really any room for God to say anything different or anything new to us? Or maybe like the seed in rocky soil, we want a faith that doesn't make demands of us, that works in our favour. But as Jesus reminds us, the problem with that kind of faith is that sooner or later adversity will come. And if our faith is founded only on things feeling good, then no, it's not going to last. Or do we sometimes want a faith that will just fit neatly with other priorities? We want a Jesus who can work around the other things in our life and not get in their way. Now let me be clear. I'm not asking these questions to beat you up or make you feel awkward. But our religious life has been stopped in its tracks in recent weeks. And as we move forward, we're having to ask some serious questions about what faith is all about. And I'm not sure that those questions are about how to give out communion within COVID-19 hygiene regulations, or how to gather for worship with an appropriate social distancing regime in place, or what we should do if we're not allowed to sing hymns, or how deep is a deep clean. I think we have far more fundamental questions to ask about what it means to seek and proclaim the kingdom of God in this new and emerging world. And I think this parable of Jesus is a message of hope in the midst of that. Because as I said earlier, this is not just a random story that Matthew has inserted into his parable section, but something of a commentary on everything that's gone before. And it seems to me that what Jesus is saying in that broader context is that you can find good and fruitful soil in many and varied places. Familiar places, religious places, but also in open spaces, in the homes of enemies and strangers. In the midst of despair and brokenness, there is still good soil to be found. And the figure of this farmer seems to say to me, if you let go and trust that seed to do its job, it will find its way to that soil. When you see the signs of failure and disappointment, don't let them define you, but believe that much of the seed will find its way to the place where it needs to be. And when you're on the receiving end, when you see that seed coming, be open to what God is sowing. Yes, we do need to think about how we can be the right kind of soil wherever we happen to find ourselves at the moment. But I want to finish by inviting you to engage with this story from another angle too. to put yourself in the place of the seed. Because, as I've already highlighted, the sower going into the field is not just a snapshot, but it's part of an endless cycle of fruitfulness. So that which was the seed is scattered by the farmer, nourished by the soil to become the fruit which once again becomes the seed. And I say that because we too have become scattered in recent months. And it's so easy for us to simply long to be gathered back and put back into the safety of our familiar gatherings and routines. And set in the context of this story, that sounds a bit daft and unreal. You can't really imagine this scattered seed rushing to find its way back into the farmer's seed bag. It was scattered so that it could be fruitful. It was scattered so that it could fulfill its purpose. Yes, being scattered would bring with it the challenges that are epitomized by those birds and rocks and thorns, but it was scattered so that it could take root and fulfill its purpose and potential. And I think that confronts us with a question that has often faced God's people. When they were led from Egypt into the desert, some wanted to go back to Egypt. When they were taken into exile, some of the psalm writers became bitter and just yearned to be taken back to Jerusalem, and all they could speak of was violence and revenge. But others listened to prophets like Jeremiah and accepted Babylon as the place that God had allowed them to be taken, and they sought to put their roots down there and to seek the well-being of those around them. And as we face terms like new normal and post-lockdown, we can yearn for what we once had. Or maybe we can take our steer from this story and recognize that sometimes things need to be scattered in order for them to bear fruit. And by grounding ourselves in this new reality and finding our roots in God there, then what might God do through us and in us in the days ahead? So whether we see ourselves as seed or soil or sowers, I sense that God has something to say to us through this story. And as Jesus himself concluded, let those with ears make sure that they hear.